I'm married to my second wife. She's a beautiful young woman. However, Viva towels have just come out with a very soft towel.
Tiny Tim was one of the most unforgettable music stars of his time. A man who turned a strange voice and an even stranger image into worldwide fame. But on the final night of his life, in front of a live audience, that same stage would become the place where his story came to a sudden and tragic end. But that night wasn't a random moment. It was the result of years of decline, private struggles, financial collapse, and serious health conditions he refused to slow down for. And when doctors strongly warned him that continuing to perform could cost him his life, he made a choice that would make his final moments far more disturbing than anyone in that room realized. The rise of Tiny Tim. In the summer of 1968, a strange and unforgettable figure appeared on American television screens. He was over 6 feet tall, with long curly hair, a pale face, and an ukulele strapped to his chest. When he opened his mouth, a voice came out that no one had ever heard before. A high, quivering falsetto that seemed to belong to another century entirely. He sang old songs about tulips and moonbeams, and millions of people could not look away. His name was Tiny Tim, and for a brief moment, he was one of the most famous entertainers in the world. But behind the ukulele and the awkward smile was a man who had spent decades struggling to be seen. A man with a personal life more turbulent than any of his fans ever knew. And the way he eventually died would shock the world and leave behind a question that took years to answer. The man who would become Tiny Tim was born Herbert Boutros Khoury on April 12, 1932, in Manhattan, New York City. His father, Boutros Khoury, was a textile worker who had come to America from Beirut, Lebanon. Tiny Tim grew up in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, a place filled with immigrants and dreamers and people trying to build something from nothing. He attended George Washington High School, but his real education happened somewhere else. When Herbert was 5 years old, he received a gift that would change his life. It was a wind-up gramophone, the kind of player that required a crank and a needle and a steady hand. Along with it came a record of a song called Beautiful Ohio, performed by a singer named Henry Burr. Tim played that record over and over, listening to the way Burr's voice floated above the melody, soft and sweet and slightly sad. That sound got inside him, and it never left. By the age of 6, he was teaching himself to play the guitar, his small fingers struggling to reach the frets on an instrument built for someone much older. He spent countless hours at the New York Public Library, not reading novels or studying history, but digging through old phonograph records and sheet music from the early 1900s. He copied songs by hand, learning the words and melodies of an era that had long since passed. His influences were not the rock and roll singers of his own generation. He loved Rudy Vallee and Bing Crosby, performers who had defined a different kind of American music. During his teenage years, he discovered that he could sing in a falsetto, a high, ethereal tone that sounded almost otherworldly. Most teenagers would have been embarrassed by such a voice, but he embraced it. It made him different, and Tim knew that being different was his only path forward. The early years of his career were brutal. He began performing in small clubs and sideshow venues in New York during the 1950s, places where the audiences were not always kind. He was over 6 feet tall, with long hair and an unusual wardrobe that looked like it had been pulled from a thrift store. His falsetto voice drew laughter more often than applause. He was ridiculed and rejected, and he lived in poverty, moving from one cheap hotel to another, surviving on whatever money he could scrape together from gigs that paid almost nothing. By the early 1960s, he had found a home in Greenwich Village, the heart of the folk and countercultural music scene. The Village was a place for oddballs and outsiders, and Herbert fit right in. He built a small but loyal following among audiences who appreciated his devotion to forgotten songs. He performed under several stage names during this period, including Larry Love, the Singing Canary, and Sir Timothy Timms. Eventually, he settled on Tiny Tim, a name that was both ironic and affectionate. He was not tiny at all, but the contradiction was part of the joke, and he was in on it. Then came 1968, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a comedy sketch show that had taken over American television, invited him to perform. He sang Tiptoe Through the Tulips, a song that had been written for a 1929 musical called Gold Diggers of Broadway. The song was old, almost 40 years old, but Tiny Tim made it feel brand new. The single became a top 20 hit on the Billboard charts, and suddenly, the man who had been laughed out of small clubs was a national sensation. He released albums under major labels and became a household name. But the fame would not last. The same qualities that made Tiny Tim a star would also make him a target. When the 1970s arrived, the world moved on, and Tiny Tim was left behind. What followed was a slow and painful decline, one that would leave him financially ruined and emotionally broken. And the worst was still to come. Tiny Tim's heartbreaking decline. By the early 1970s, the world had started to move on. The audience that once found him charming began to see him as a joke. The television invitations stopped coming, and the man who had made millions of people smile found himself alone, struggling to pay for a hotel room, wondering where it all went wrong. After the success of his first two albums, God Bless Tiny Tim in 1968 and For All My Little Friends in 1969, his later records failed to find an audience. The public had grown tired of the ukulele and the falsetto and the old-fashioned songs. What had once felt fresh and surprising now felt like a gimmick. Audiences began to see him more as a novelty act than a serious musician. And once that label stuck, it was almost impossible to remove. The television appearances that had made him famous dwindled to nothing. The variety shows that once fought to book him no longer returned his calls. His strange and wonderful persona, the very thing that had made him a star, became a problem in a music industry that was moving toward rock and roll and disco. Record labels lost interest quickly. Reprise Records, which had released his most successful albums, dropped him from its roster. He tried to keep going on his own, releasing music on small independent labels that he named after himself. None of these efforts worked. The records did not sell, and the radio stations did not play them. His attempts to be taken seriously as a music historian and archivist were laughed off by critics who could not see past the ukulele. He knew more about forgotten American songs than almost anyone alive, but no one wanted to listen to him talk about it. They wanted him to sing Tiptoe Through the Tulips and then get off the stage. He tried to reinvent himself. He made a children's album that earned a Grammy nomination, a rare bright spot in a decade of darkness. But the nomination did not lead to a comeback. He performed at large festivals, including the famous Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, sharing bills with some of the biggest names in rock music. Those moments should have launched a new chapter in his career, but they did not. The crowds were curious to see him, but they were not interested in buying his records or following his work. He kept recording through the 1980s and 90s, but his albums were released on tiny labels with almost no distribution. He tried to reach younger audiences through novelty appearances, but the young audiences only laughed at him. They did not buy his music. During his peak years, Tiny Tim made a fortune from record sales, television appearances, and the wedding broadcast that millions of people watched. But he had no one to help him manage it. He spent extravagantly on hotels and clothes and old memorabilia, buying the things that had been out of reach during his poverty-stricken youth. He had no financial advisors and no long-term plan. By the 1980s, his money was gone. He was living modestly, often depending on whatever he could earn from a small performance at a county fair or a nostalgia convention. The people around him did not help. Promoters and managers often underpaid him, knowing that he had nowhere else to go. They exploited his strangeness for publicity, booking him for events that treated him as a freak rather than a performer. His parents had never fully approved of his chosen path. They loved him, but they did not understand him. They had hoped for a more conventional life for their son, and watching him struggle from one small gig to another was painful for them. There were family tensions and arguments about money and image, and what it meant to be successful. His daughter, Tulip Victoria, grew up far from the spotlight, living a modest life that had nothing to do with her father's fame. He loved her deeply, but he could not give her the stability that she deserved. Through all of it, he kept performing. His health was failing, and his finances were worse, but he would not stop. He remained devoted to the music he loved, collecting obscure songs and performing them for anyone who would listen. But most people never realized that behind the novelty act was a turbulent personal life, filled with heartbreak and pain, that would later contribute to his painful demise. Tiny Tim's turbulent personal life. While millions of Americans watched Tiny Tim strum his ukulele and sing in that high, sweet voice, they had no idea what was happening behind the closed doors of his private life. He was married 3 times, and each marriage brought its own kind of pain. He fought a bitter custody battle for his only daughter, and his eccentricity was used against him in ways that left deep scars. His first marriage was the one the whole world saw. On December 17, 1969, Tiny Tim married Victoria May Budinger, a girl known to fans as Miss Vicky, live on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The broadcast drew between 30 and 35 million viewers, making it one of the most watched television events of its era. Tiny Tim was 37 years old at the time, 20 years older than his bride. The age difference raised eyebrows, but the public was willing to overlook it because the wedding felt like pure entertainment. What the cameras did not capture was the strain that would follow. The couple had a daughter, Tulip Victoria, born in 1971, but the marriage was already beginning to crack. The age gap that had seemed quirky during the televised wedding became a real problem in daily life. The pressures of fame weighed heavily on both of them, and Tiny Tim's finances were never as stable as they appeared on television. By the time their divorce was finalized in 1977, the relationship had been strained beyond repair. The custody battle over Tulip Victoria was particularly painful. Tiny Tim's unconventional persona and his unstable income were used against him in court. The lawyers argued that a man who dressed in thrift store clothes and sang in a falsetto could not provide a stable home for a young girl. Miss Vicky sought greater control over their daughter's upbringing, and the court agreed with her. Tulip Victoria went to live with her mother, though Tiny Tim maintained contact with her whenever he could. The distance between them never fully closed. His second marriage came in 1984, when he wed a woman named Jan Alweis. This union lasted 11 years, ending in divorce in 1995. The relationship was marked by the same problems that had plagued his first marriage. Money was always tight, and his career was in decline. There were disagreements over how to spend what little they had, and the constant pressure of living on the edge took its toll. By the time the divorce was finalized, Tiny Tim was emotionally and financially drained. He had given everything he had to 2 marriages, and both had ended badly. His third marriage began in August of 1995, just over a year before his death. His new wife was Susan Marie Gardner, a fan who had followed his career and become his companion in his later years. She provided something that had been missing from his life for a long time: stability. She did not care about his faded fame or his empty pockets. She loved him for who he was, and she stayed with him until the very end. She was there on the night of his last performance, watching from the wings when tragedy struck. Beyond his marriages, Tiny Tim also faced legal battles that few people knew about. In 1975, OUI magazine, a publication owned by Playboy, ran an article titled Miss Vicky. The article focused on his ex-wife, but it also made claims about Tiny Tim that he found deeply hurtful and damaging to his reputation. He believed the article was defamatory and that it invaded his privacy. So he did something that surprised everyone. He sued Playboy Publications, along with Hugh Hefner and others, seeking justice for what had been written about him. The case was filed in 1976. Tiny Tim argued that the article had caused him both personal and professional injury. But the court dismissed the case because he had filed it too late. Under New York law, the statute of limitations for such claims was 1 year from the date the magazine was first distributed. The issue came out in September of 1975, and Tiny Tim did not file his lawsuit until September of 1976, just past the deadline. The case was thrown out, and he received nothing. It was another loss in a life filled with them. Behind the ukulele and the falsetto was a man who had been hurt by the same industry that had made him famous. He had been exploited by promoters, abandoned by record labels, and laughed at by critics. His marriages had failed. His daughter had been taken from him, and his lawsuit had gone nowhere. He kept performing because performing was the only thing that made sense. But his body was failing him, and the signs that the end was near were impossible to ignore. Tiny Tim's health struggles. By the mid-1990s, Tiny Tim was not the same man who had charmed millions of television viewers 25 years earlier. The long curls were thinner and streaked with gray. The face that had once seemed boyish and strange now looked worn and tired. He was only in his early 60s, but his body had aged far beyond its years. Behind the scenes, away from the small crowds who still came to see him perform, Tiny Tim was fighting a battle that no amount of showmanship could hide. His health was failing, and the doctors who examined him gave him warnings that he simply refused to hear. For years, he had lived with diabetes, a condition that required careful management of his diet and his blood sugar. He struggled to follow the rules that his doctors set for him. He loved sweets and rich foods, and the discipline that diabetes demanded did not come naturally to a man who had spent his whole life doing things his own way. On top of the diabetes, he had congestive heart failure, which meant that his heart was too weak to pump blood effectively through his body. He also suffered from chronic heart disease, which put constant strain on his entire cardiovascular system. These were not minor problems. They were life-threatening conditions that required rest and medical supervision. But Tiny Tim did not know how to rest. Performing was the only thing that made him feel alive, and no doctor's warning was going to keep him off a stage. The first serious warning came on September 28, 1996. Tiny Tim was performing at the Ukulele Hall of Fame Expo, held at the Montague Grange Hall in Massachusetts. The crowd was small but enthusiastic, filled with the kind of dedicated fans who had followed his career through the lean years. He was in the middle of a song when something went wrong. His face changed, his body went rigid, and then he collapsed on stage, right in front of the people who had come to see him. It was a heart attack, not the kind that kills instantly, but the kind that serves as a terrifying preview of what is coming. The show stopped. Someone called for help. An ambulance rushed him to the Franklin County Medical Center in Greenfield, Massachusetts. He spent nearly 3 weeks in that hospital, recovering from the attack and undergoing tests to determine how much damage had been done. The doctors were clear with him. His heart was in bad shape. His diabetes made everything more complicated. If he kept performing, if he kept putting his body through the stress of travel and late nights and the physical demands of a show, he would not live much longer. They told him not to perform again. They used plain language, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The risks were too high. His heart could give out at any moment, and the next attack might be the one that killed him. They wanted him to rest, to change his diet, to take his medications, to live a quiet life away from the spotlight that had been both his greatest love and his greatest burden. Tiny Tim listened to everything they said, but then he ignored it. He insisted on returning to the stage. He told anyone who would listen that he owed it to his fans, that he could not let them down, that music was the only thing that gave his life meaning. His body was telling him to stop, but the need to perform was louder than the signs his body was giving him. In the weeks after his September collapse, he looked worse than ever. Fans who saw him at his penultimate shows noticed how frail he had become. He moved slowly, as if every step cost him something. His face was pale and drawn. He seemed exhausted before he even opened his mouth to sing. Some audience members left his shows feeling more worried than entertained. They questioned whether he should be on stage at all, whether someone should step in and make him stop for his own good. But no one did. He was an adult, and he had made his choice. Thanksgiving Day of 1996 was especially hard. He spent part of the holiday in the hospital, experiencing severe pain that his doctors could not immediately explain. He was released after a few days, but the message was clear. His body was breaking down. The diabetes and the heart disease and the congestive failure were all working together to pull him under. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Still, he booked another show. He had been invited to perform at a club in Minneapolis, and he was determined to be there. His wife, Susan, begged him to cancel. His doctors advised against the trip, but Tiny Tim would not listen. He packed his ukulele and got on the plane, heading toward a stage that would become his final resting place. The world was about to witness something no one could have predicted. Tiny Tim's final performance. On the last night of November in 1996, Tiny Tim stepped onto a stage for the final time, determined to do what he had always done. The event was called An Evening Under the Stars, a benefit dinner hosted by the Women's Club of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The occasion was meant to support the American Heart Association, an organization dedicated to preventing the very condition that was slowly killing him. His wife, Sue, had helped arrange the event through her stepmother, who purchased copies of his album Prisoner of Love to hand out to the people who came. The room was filled with dinner tables and white tablecloths, and people who had come for a pleasant evening of nostalgia. They did not know that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for decades. Before the show, Tiny Tim appeared frail and disoriented. His legs were swollen, making it difficult for him to walk. He seemed confused, as if the world around him was moving faster than he could follow. Sue helped him get ready, adjusting his suit and straightening his collar, trying to hide the physical decay that had become impossible to ignore. He looked like a ghost of the man who had once serenaded millions of viewers on The Tonight Show. But he was determined to perform. He had made a commitment, and he would not break it. The set list from that night is incomplete because the show ended so abruptly. But one song was played. He reportedly sang Tiptoe Through the Tulips, the song that had made him famous nearly 30 years earlier. The high falsetto that had once seemed so strange and wonderful now sounded thin and fragile. He was not halfway through the song when his body gave out. He suffered a massive heart attack while singing the words that the whole world knew. Some people in the audience thought it was part of his act. They laughed at first, assuming that the collapse was a joke. Another strange moment from a performer who had built his career on being unusual. But then they saw Sue rush to his side. They saw the color drain from his face. They realized that this was not a performance. This was real. He was taken immediately to Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. Doctors worked on him, trying to restart his heart, trying to pull him back from the edge. But the damage was too severe. The years of diabetes and heart disease and ignoring medical advice had caught up with him all at once. At 11:20 p.m., Tiny Tim was pronounced dead from cardiac arrest. He was 64 years old. The news spread quickly. Journalists who had not thought about Tiny Tim in years suddenly had to write his obituary. The headlines emphasized the unusual circumstances of his death. He had collapsed while singing his most famous song on a stage in front of paying customers. He had died doing exactly what he had always done. The media coverage focused on his devotion to performing. Despite severe health warnings, despite a heart attack just 2 months earlier, despite every doctor telling him to stop, he had kept going. Some called him ignorant. Others called him brave. Most simply noted that he had lived and died for his art, a phrase that is often overused but seemed to fit him perfectly. Fans and fellow musicians paid tribute to him in the days that followed. They remembered him as more than a novelty act. They remembered him as a serious archivist of early American music, a man who had devoted his life to preserving songs that might otherwise have been forgotten. His funeral was held in Minneapolis, and he was buried at Lakewood Cemetery. The service was small, attended by family and close friends. Sue was there, wearing black and holding back tears. The fans who had followed him through the lean years were there too, standing quietly at the edges, paying their respects to a man who had given them so many strange and beautiful moments. According to insider reports, the benefit concert on November 30th, 1996, was recorded. Someone had set up equipment to capture the evening, intending to preserve a performance by a beloved entertainer. No one expected that the recording would capture his death. Clips of his final performance, including the moment he collapsed, have circulated online through platforms like YouTube and various collector circles. The full recording has never been officially released, but fragments exist, and those fragments confirm the authenticity of what happened that night. Tiny Tim died doing the only thing he ever wanted to do. He sang about tulips and moonbeams, but he lived through heartbreak and failure and the slow decay of his own body. What's your favorite memory of Tiny Tim? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.